My name is Jacob Slater, and I'm 37. A journalist from New York. I never sought fame, but I certainly knew how to make money off other people's tragedies. My job is to dig up dirt in the dark corners of life, exposing it to the light. Though, to be honest, most people would rather not see the truth. When I received the news of my father's death, it didn't affect me much. We had barely spoken for the last 20 years. However, this very message was pulling me back to a godforsaken place, the town of Ravenfall, Maine. I had promised myself never to return. Not out of sentimentality or pain, this town had always been like a festering wound. Ravenfall stood at the end of the world, where everything was dirty and neglected, old wooden houses, streets overgrown with weeds, and forests that breathed with ancient fear. Once you end up here, the road leads only one way, into hopelessness. Driving through the grim autumn forests, I stared through the windshield, trying to shake off the memories clinging to me like cobwebs. The fog was thick, like milk, and snaked between the trees. The sun had long since vanished beyond the horizon, leaving only dark silhouettes of trees that looked like giants leaning toward the road. From the old radio I had turned on for company, the raspy voice of a local host crackled through. "Good evening, Ravenfall. Tonight is a special night. Be careful out there on the roads." Suddenly, the radio's signal faltered, and instead of music, strange signals began to play. At first, they were short, like knocks, and then a low hum emerged, which sounded to me like either a voice or a cry. I slammed my hand against the radio, and the sound disappeared. Up ahead, an old, rusty sign appeared. "Welcome to Ravenfall." Beneath the peeling letters, someone had carved another message with a knife. "They already know you're here." "Idiots," I muttered under my breath and pressed the gas pedal. Ravenfall greeted me with its usual gloom. The small square, the old roadside store, it felt as though time had stopped here 20 years ago. The people? They hadn't changed either. Vacant stares, whispers behind my back. I was used to this kind of attitude. They had hated me even when I was a child. Now that I'd returned, they clearly didn't like it. Entering the old store, I felt the sting of a cold, hostile gaze. Behind the counter stood Ed Trammell, the owner, who must have been pushing 90, but he didn't look a day older. His face was wrinkled like a dried apple, covered in spots. "What do you want here, Jake?" he grumbled in a low voice, not even bothering to look at me. "Just came to collect my father's things," I replied and grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the counter. Ed looked at me as though I carried the plague. "You shouldn't have come back here." Some of us still remember what happened. "What do you remember?" I asked, but Ed had already turned away. My father's house looked even worse than I had imagined. An old, half-rotted structure with peeling paint. The windows were dusty, and the door barely hung on its hinges. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt an odd sensation, as though someone was watching me. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. I walked through the rooms, feeling the cold wind seeping through cracks in the walls. On the kitchen table, a few old letters and my father's notebooks lay scattered. I picked up the first one I could find. "The deal is unfulfilled. I see them every night. They will take me if I don't find a replacement." I clenched my fingers, feeling anger rise in my chest. What the hell is this nonsense? I muttered through gritted teeth, throwing the notebook back onto the table. Something thudded in the attic, and I spun around sharply. Silence. But there was no peace left for me. I never liked this place. And now, it seemed, the feeling was mutual. I woke up suddenly. The night was black as a bottomless pit, and the silence was so deep it felt like it pressed against my ears. Then I heard a rustling sound. Soft, like footsteps on fallen leaves. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic. And it was getting closer. I walked to the window and pulled back the old curtain. Outside, all I could see was a thick, milky white fog. It hugged the trees and the street, as if trying to hide something from my eyes. But even through this gloom, I noticed a silhouette. It stood near the edge of the forest. Blurry, indistinct, but unnaturally tall and perfectly still. A cold, creeping sensation washed over me, fear. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice cracked and came out hoarse, almost pitiful. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the sound changed. The rustling turned into heavy, slow footsteps, echoing louder and louder. Thudding beats, as if something massive, barefoot, was stomping across wet earth. I wasn't a coward. No. But standing in that room, where the shadows seemed darker than the night itself, I couldn't stay any longer. I grabbed my jacket, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The cold, damp fog enveloped me like a sack. It was so dark I could barely see my own feet. The footsteps, they hadn't stopped. On the contrary, I now heard them to my right, somewhere near the trees. I turned my head and froze. The figure was standing again at the edge of the forest. This time, I saw it more clearly. It was something vaguely resembling a person but with proportions that defied reason. It was too thin, too tall, its head tilted as though its neck couldn't support the weight. And it was staring at me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I was certain that its gaze was burning right through me. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, trying to force the fear out of my voice. Silence. Only the footsteps grew louder, and the shadows and the fog seemed to shift, creeping closer. I began backing up, my hands already fumbling for the keys in my pocket, ready to bolt for the car at any moment. "Jacob!" I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a voice behind me. I turned and saw a figure that looked almost ghostly in the dim light. It was Sheriff Tom Harper. He looked exactly the same as he had 20 years ago, tall, broad-shouldered, with rugged features, but his eyes were empty, as though carved from stone. "What are you doing here, Harper?" I barked, trying to mask my nerves. The sheriff walked calmly toward me, oblivious to the fog and the dreadful figure in the distance. He didn't even glance in that direction. "You shouldn't have come back, Jacob," he said in a low voice. "Ravenfall doesn't tolerate outsiders. You know that better than anyone. What's happening here? What the hell is that in the woods?" I jabbed a finger toward the silhouette, but when I looked again, it was gone. Only trees and fog remained. Harper was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. His voice was quiet and menacing. "They're the Watchers. They've always been here. And they're watching everyone who tries to break the deal." "What deal?" I shouted, but Harper just shook his head. "Stop asking questions, Jacob. Don't wake them. You don't know what you're dealing with." He turned and walked toward his car, leaving me standing alone. I watched him disappear into the fog, feeling the cold seep through my clothes and choke me. Silence fell over the town again, but I knew this wasn't the end. Someone, or something, was still watching me. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. I hadn't slept well, constantly jolting awake to strange sounds, rustling, tapping, as if someone was walking on the roof. But now I had a purpose. I wasn't about to be a puppet in this twisted spectacle. If the whole town thought they could scare me, they were dead wrong. I decided to start with the library. That place in Ravenfall had always felt like a mausoleum, cold, dark, and dusty, much like the townspeople themselves. When I entered, I was greeted by the smell of old books and the heavy gaze of the librarian, Mrs. Clarissa Long. She was as old as the library itself and always wore dark clothing that resembled mourning attire. "Are you looking for something specific, Jacob?" she asked, her thin fingers stroking each other, like the legs of a spider. "Legends about the forest, about people disappearing," I snapped, having no patience for pleasantries. "Tell me everything you know." Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer to me and whispered, "The colonists made a deal, Jacob. That was over 300 years ago. The forest watchers, spirits, creatures, no one knows what they truly are. But they control the forest. According to the deal, someone must disappear every year. Whoever becomes their sacrifice never comes back. If no one vanishes, they come for everyone." "Nonsense," I cut her off, but my heart tightened in my chest. "They see everything. And they hate it when someone notices their faces." Her voice trembled. "If you've seen them, you're next." I didn't stay to listen to any more of her ramblings and left. But the words, "They see everything," kept echoing in my mind. Returning home, I went back to my father's journals. I hated that man, but now I realized he knew something. In an old, tattered notebook, I found a few phrases written in a trembling hand. "They come for those who see their faces. I saw them all. Eyes that burn in the darkness, hands as long as branches. Their faces can never be forgotten." On the last page, there was only one word: run. I threw the journal onto the table. Anger swirled in my chest. "What were you hiding, old man?" I hissed through gritted teeth. That night I didn't sleep. Rain drummed against the windows, and the fog crept slowly into the town, wrapping it in its cold embrace. I couldn't just sit and do nothing. I needed answers. It felt as though the forest was calling me, mocking me. I grabbed a flashlight, a jacket, and stepped into the night. The forest was black as tar. The heavy fog clung to the trees, making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. Each step echoed so loudly it felt like the whole world could hear me treading on the leaves. At first, I thought they were my own footsteps. But no. Someone was walking alongside me, slowly in sync with my steps. I stopped. The sound stopped too. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going. And then I felt it. A cold breath against the back of my neck. "You already know who we are, Jacob. You won't escape." The voice was a whisper, like the hiss of a snake. I felt paralyzed. Slowly, I turned around, and the flashlight slipped from my hands, extinguishing itself in the swampy ground. Before me, in the fog, shadows emerged. Tall, blurred like phantoms, but their silhouettes resembled human figures. They stood silently, yet I could feel them staring at me. Rage consumed me. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the darkness. In response, only silence and the sound of heavy footsteps closing in from all sides. I bolted back toward the house, but it felt like the fog was growing thicker, the footsteps faster. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me and barricading it with a chair. My breathing was ragged, cold sweat streaming down my face. Then, rustling outside the window. They wouldn't leave. And I knew it. After that night, I couldn't stay silent. What I'd seen in the forest, the voices, the shadows, it was real. I knew something terrible was happening in this town, and someone had to stop it. But not everyone wanted to hear the truth. In fact, no one did. When I walked into the local bar to speak with people, every gaze turned toward me, heavy, silent. The woman at the counter stopped mid-conversation. The bartender, wiping a glass with a filthy rag, stared at me like I'd personally offended him. "You all know what's in the forest," I began, holding my ground even though rage was churning inside me. "And you all stay silent. Do you really think this is okay? People are disappearing." "Get out of here, Jacob," grumbled an old man in a hat. "This isn't your concern." "Then whose concern is it? Every year you sacrifice someone's life to appease those things? This isn't survival, it's madness." A heavy silence fell over the room. I realized I'd crossed the line when a few men stood up from their seats. Their faces were empty, but their eyes were filled with hatred. One of them, a hulking man named Hank, approached me so closely that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You're the problem, Jacob," he muttered, staring directly into my eyes. "We protect this town. You're putting it at risk." "I'm trying to save you from yourselves," I snapped back. "Leave while you still can," added another voice behind me. But I didn't leave. This town felt like an infected wound, one that had finally begun to fester and burst open. I turned and headed for City Hall, knowing I needed to have a face-to-face conversation with the mayor of this rotting nest. Mayor of Ravenfall, Thomas Gray, sat at his desk like a king in his throne room. His expensive suit felt out of place in this town, but he wore it as though power was second nature to him. When I entered, he didn't even look up, continuing to write something in his notebook. "I see you just don't know when to stop, Jacob," he finally said, setting his pen aside. What do you want this time? Answers, I snapped, settling into the chair across from him. I know about the Watchers, I know about the deal. You're all in on this, aren't you? The mayor looked at me calmly, his face showing neither anger nor fear. If anything, it showed mild fatigue. You think you're better than us, Jacob? His voice was low, measured, but laced with venom. You don't understand. We do this to survive. It's always been this way. Long before me, long before you. We pay the price, but the town keeps living. The price? I could barely contain myself. You sacrificed lives. That's not survival. It's a curse. And what do you suggest? His eyes flashed with fury. Fight them? The deal is the only thing keeping us safe. Look at your father. He didn't listen, and he paid the price. Those words hit me harder than any punch could. What did you do to him? I hissed. Nothing, he replied calmly. He did it to himself. He saw their faces. And people don't live long after that, Jacob. They come for those who know too much. I stood and leaned over the desk, locking eyes with him. I won't stop. You can hate me, you can even try to get rid of me. But I won't let these things control people's lives. The mayor smirked faintly at the corners of his mouth. You're not the first hero to say that. And you won't be the last. But trust me, the Watchers already know you're here. I stormed out of his office, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. With every step, I felt the streets of the town closing in on me, tightening like a noose. People watched, their silent gazes following me, but no one said a word. They were all against me. And I knew it. I couldn't stay in this cursed place any longer. The air was heavy, as if the entire forest was trying to strangle me. My backpack, hastily stuffed with my father's notes and a flashlight, sat on the passenger seat. I started the car and slammed on the gas, not looking back. To hell with all of you, I muttered through clenched teeth. The forest road was nearly impossible to see. The headlights cut through the thick fog, but it closed back in immediately, like living flesh. I drove fast, recklessly, at a speed that could have killed me. But right now, dying against a tree seemed like a lesser evil than those who lurked in the shadows. 5 miles, maybe 10. The road was empty, and for a moment, hope flickered inside me. But then I saw it. The old, battered sign. Welcome to Ravenfall. I slammed the brakes so hard the tires screeched against the gravel. The car came to a halt, and I stared at the sign, unable to believe my eyes. This couldn't be real. I had driven straight. I was getting away. I stumbled out of the car like a madman, walking up to the sign, my trembling fingers nearly touching it. Beneath the main letters, the same carved words still stared back at me. They already know. No. No, 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 I whispered, feeling the rising tide of panic choking me. I turned around. The fog had thickened so much that I couldn't even see my car anymore. And then they appeared. From the mist, their silhouettes emerged, tall, blurred, and wrong. Shapes that vaguely resembled people, but their proportions were twisted and unnatural. They stood motionless, like statues in the darkness, watching me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would tear through my chest. I staggered backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Stay back! I shouted into the void, my voice cracking. The figures didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence alone swallowed me whole. I could feel them in my mind, crawling through the cracks of my sanity. And then, through the silence, the whisper came again, soft and cold as death itself. You already know who we are, Jacob. You can't leave. I stumbled back to the car, fumbling with the door, desperate to escape, but deep down, I already knew the truth. There was no leaving Ravenfall. They wouldn't let me. The silhouettes. At first, they were thin and distant, like shadows lingering at the edges of my vision. But they were getting closer, more real. Tall, unnaturally thin figures with long arms that hung nearly to the ground. They stood on either side of the road, moving imperceptibly, like leaves rustling in the wind. My breath hitched, my heart hammering in my throat. I stumbled back toward the car, but it was already too late. They had surrounded me. From all sides, silently, they emerged from the fog. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And all of them were watching me. I could feel their gaze, cold, hungry, and relentless. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, but my voice cracked and faltered. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, they began to move forward, not hurried, but unstoppable. Their silhouettes merged together, becoming a single, solid black mass that crept closer and closer. I staggered back a few steps until I felt the cold, damp earth beneath my feet. My knees buckled. I couldn't run anymore. The fog closed in, swallowing me whole along with them. Their shadows consumed the light, the air, everything. I was sinking into darkness, their presence pressing down on me like the weight of the entire forest. There was no escape. No sound. No hope. And then, as the blackness claimed me, I finally understood. You don't leave Ravenfall. Ravenfall takes you. And then I heard the whisper. Sinister, layered with countless voices, it felt closer than my own breath. You're with us now, Jacob. No one leaves Ravenfall. The darkness consumed me, cold and absolute. I felt no fear, no pain. Only emptiness. The last thing I heard was the laughter from the fog, mocking, unbearably familiar. And then, nothing.